Worst days. Of course people are going to think we like Felix or Hyunjin. Worst days. Of course we're going to think... I don't know what I was saying. Worst days. Of course we're going to be listening to Stray Kids 24/7. Worst days. So probably 99% of us is delusional. Worst days. Of course we're going to be mean to our skizzos. Well, I'm not. Other stays are. Worst days. Of course people are going to think that we just only like Stray Kids. That's not what I was supposed to say. Worst days. Of course. Can't think. Worst days. Of course people are going to think that we're obsessed with Felix. Worst days. Of course people are going to think we have their cologne. Worst days. Of course we think everything... That's not what I was going to say. Worst days. Of course we think it's funny when Han gets scared of bugs. Worst days. Of course we're going to have the same personality as our bias. Worst days. Of course we follow all of their channels. Worst days. Of course we're going to just stay up all night probably doing something Delulu or something. Worst days. Of course we're going to get grossed out when someone posted some shit about something nasty about like Felix or something like that. Channel Felix is one and only. That's disgusting. Worst days. Of course people are going to think we only care about Stray Kids and not anyone else. I care about everyone in this world, so even my followers. I mean my subscribers. Big hug. Worst days. Of course we're going to cry at a concert. Worst days. Of course people are going to think we're influencers because we like Stray Kids. I can't be talking, I am an influencer. Worst days. Of course our channel's going to be 99% about Stray Kids. Worst days. Of course some people sleep with their skizzos because they're fudging delusional. Yeah, I can't be talking. I might. I don't know. Because I don't have skizzos yet. Worst days. Of course we know everything about Stray Kids, like their blood type, their birthday. Yeah. Worst days. Of course every single thing we see with wolves, we're going to think of Bang Chan. Worst days. Of course every single time we see some picture of one of their abs, we're going to start crashing out. Worst days. Of course we love having skizzos. Worst days. Of course we think Bang Chan's the best leader. Worst days. Of course Bang Chan's our second dad. Worst days. Of course we think Bang Chan's so old. Worst days. Of course we love saying their iconic lines. Worst days. Of course people are going to think we're totally hecking obsessed with Felix, but we're not. Worst days. Of course when we tell people what bias means, they're not going to have no idea. Worst days. Of course when we're swinging, 99% of the time, you're going to catch us listening to Chick Chick Boom or something. Worst days. Of course we celebrate Stay Week. Worst days. Of course we think about Woojin all the time, even though he's not even in Stray Kids anymore. Worst days. Of course, every single time we see a Korean person, we're going to think it's Stray Kids or something. We're going to think of Stray Kids or something. Worst days. Of course, we're going to think Converse shoes are cool. We're stays. Of course we're going to have pictures of them. We're stays. Of course 99% of us probably has their bias as their background. We're stays. Of course when we climb a tree we're going to think of Han. We're stays. So we're always probably going to say Sungmin in the building.